Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins one bleak day for a girl who was supposed to be killed. She sat in the middle of the hall and listened to the man who was supposed to conduct her death. This man said that the execution of Helen de Wittfaasch will be put into action because they certainly could not have acted differently. The girl understood perfectly well what was happening, so she didn't even try to resist. Some nobles gathered around who wanted to watch this death, as well as guards who made sure that everything was carried out according to the rules. The priest who actually organized this death said that now her soul would be cleansed after this ritual. At that moment, Elena herself was kneeling, handcuffed, and thinking about where she had made a mistake, since she had come to this. The man then began to pass her the cup with the drink and told her to raise her gaze to the Holy Grail. The girl took the drink, but still thought that perhaps all this happened because she was too cowardly, or because she refused to marry this man. Of course, Elena didn't have a precise answer, only guesses that she could never justify or refute. Before drinking the wine containing poison, she looked at the Holy Grail as she was asked. Elena held a glass in her hands and was incredibly angry with herself, and it wasn't just her who found it hard to realize that her life now looked like this. And besides, the girl was incredibly irritated by the words of the priest, who considered running away from misfortune a great sin for which it was necessary to kill and cleanse her sinful soul. But the girl had no choice, so without thinking twice, she drank the wine that contained poison and immediately felt pain throughout her entire body. Because the poison was quite strong, she fell to the ground, her entire body convulsing, and the men who were present simply stood there and watched her suffer. Even before her death, Elena was able to see that some of the guards had a smile on their faces, and this struck her even more. She could not believe that people could be so heartless that they rejoice at the death of another. Blood had already started to flow from her mouth, and she thought that if she had at least one more chance to live, then next time she would definitely choose the right path for herself. At that moment, she no longer saw anything familiar around her. Everything became incredibly bright, as if she were already directly leaving for the next world. In her mind, Elena turned to God and really hoped that there was at least one drop of compassion in him and that he would be able to give her mercy. The girl hoped madly that he would really take pity on her and give her another chance at life, because she believed that she deserved it. The truth is that she didn't want to die yet, because there was so much she hadn't done yet. With these thoughts, Elena's body went completely numb. She let out her last breath and even stopped twitching. The girl's consciousness passed to the other world. However, that was what she thought, because immediately after complete darkness, Elena opened her eyes and noticed that she was lying in bed. Of course, she was very surprised by this, so the girl immediately took off the blanket and wanted to go to the mirror to understand what was happening. Looking down, the girl saw that she was wearing a pink nightgown, and besides, she could stand on her feet without any problems because the pain in her chest that had been there for years had simply disappeared. Elena couldn't believe her happiness. She didn't understand why and how this could happen. She remembered perfectly well how she drank that poisoned cup in the church and therefore should have died. However, now she is in a bright room, completely alive, and even without her pains. Elena immediately went to the mirror and understood perfectly well that she should have died. But this did not happen. The girl looked closely at her appearance and could not understand that this had really happened. Her prayers had been answered. She touched her incredibly dry skin and spiky hair and looked at her broken nails and immediately realized what time in her life she was back in. Elena understood perfectly well that she had returned to the time when she had just been captured, which meant that this was not the happiest period in the girl's life. Of course, she really wanted another chance at life, but she didn't understand why it all happened that way. Because of this, she became very angry and even punched the glass. The mirror shattered and the pieces flew in all directions. Elena couldn't believe that out of all those things she had become a princess again, who had no right to vote or choose. In fact, there was one kingdom located on the eastern continent, which was called Wittfaasch, and Elena was born the second princess of this very kingdom. She was quite famous throughout the continent, because her family occupied a significant place in society. But even though she had a fairly high status as a princess, she had no choice, and Elena simply did not know how to live her life again without her own opinion. The girl had absolutely nothing, and she was very desperate when she found out that she had again found herself in that most terrible time for herself. The maids who were standing nearby at that moment heard the glass break and fall to the ground, and they immediately ran into the princess's room. The maids ran up and started picking up the pieces with their bare hands. They said that it was just awful, and also asked the girl if she had accidentally hurt herself. One of the maids asked her to stay where she was, then took her hands and carefully began to lead her out of the place where there were many fragments. Of course, the servants did not understand why the mirror had broken, and they also asked if the girl had any injuries. They decided to find out for sure, because they understood that they would be punished if they missed even the slightest scratch. At that moment, the head maid entered the room and also asked if the lady had any injuries. The maid, who was looking at the girl attentively, said that, fortunately, everything was all right. Then the woman breathed a sigh of relief and said that this was very good, after which she turned to Princess Helen and said that her body did not belong to herself alone. And she asked the girl to never forget about this and not act so stupidly and recklessly again. As soon as Elena heard these words, she became incredibly angry, because this was the position of her personality in this world that she hated the most. The head maid, who had been very worried, finally breathed a sigh of relief and said that, no matter what, she had finally received precious peace of mind. Of course, the royal family offered treasures to the nobles they wanted as allies, and her family hoped to ensure the loyalty of all of them. However, the real treasure in their arsenal was not Elena at all, as many might have assumed. This was precisely the wealth that came with the marriage of a princess. In other words, it was nothing more than a treasure chest that came with the girl. Some time had passed since then. The sun had already gone far from the horizon and was shining incredibly brightly. The maids, on the orders of their boss, began to tidy up the girl. The first thing they did, of course, was to take care of her beautiful silky hair. And most importantly, the maid who stayed nearby said that she believed that Elena was well aware of the fact that she was quite a precious princess for their family. The woman also said that she had no choice. She was simply destined to marry Marquis Burkett and therefore must take care of her already fragile body. The maid looked straight into the girl's eyes through the mirror and asked her to be very careful not to harm herself by acting so recklessly. She also told Elena that before she did anything, she should first think about the shame she would bring to the royal family. The girl just sat there silently, frowning. Of course, it was unpleasant for her to hear all this for the second time, especially knowing her fate from her past life. Some time passed from that moment, and Elena was finally ready. She was dressed in a luxurious outfit. Her hair was tidied up, and she was even sprayed with a pleasant floral scent. The main thing is that the maid, who had been carefully watching the whole process, finally breathed a sigh of relief and told the princess that she was truly beautiful and everything was ready for the meeting. Elena herself was not as happy as everyone else. She even wondered if the woman was tired of repeating this every day. Of course, absolutely all the servants and not only treated her with such attention and caution, only because they could not afford to show disrespect to the person who would soon be sent to marry a very important person in society. Then Elena suddenly remembered that she was unsure of one factor, and asked the maid how old she was at that time. Of course, the maid was very surprised at first, but she knew that she should not ignore her, and said that she had turned 20 years old last month. Elena immediately thanked her for this, and she herself understood perfectly well that this meant that she had returned to her past 5 years ago. After a short silence, the maid said that she was no longer a child who could afford to be selfish without any consequences. These words made Elena even more angry. She simply turned around and started to walk away from the maid because this woman really irritated her. The maid herself sighed heavily at that moment and understood that this was worrying her. She was not sure how the girl would behave at an important meeting, so she knew that her career was now in danger. The maid also did not understand how much longer they should make the poor Marquis wait, because he had already been waiting for Elena for quite a long time, and now she was also late for the meeting. In fact, the Marquis of Burkett, or as he was also called, Lord Wald, was the man to whom Helen was promised to be handed over directly. He was the chief knight of the kingdom, which repeatedly defended them from the invasion of the Lipa kingdom. This man was a young man from the Seven Heroes and was considered the shield of their kingdom because he never lost a single battle and always defended them masterfully. He was also important to the kingdom because if something happened to him, even the entire nation would be in danger because they were simply interconnected. Elena knew all this very well from her personal experience in a past life, which was, unfortunately, not as joyful as one might assume. The girl went to the dressing table and saw there a small chest in which she kept the treasures with which she completely surrendered herself to her husband. The girl took it with trembling hands and understood perfectly well what was now awaiting her ahead, but she simply could not do anything about it. Initially, the girl was supposed to get married 2 years ago, and thereby strengthen the foundation of the Marquise's ownership of the lands. However, she was still unmarried, and all because Lord Wald is a ruthless man who killed many without any hesitation. He was very cruel and cold-blooded. Of course, this man scared the girl incredibly much, but she hated the thought of dying again with regret in her heart and never having a second chance even more. That's why this time Elena was very serious. She already had a plan of action in her head that she was going to stick to. The girl taking this box turned to the head maid and said that she had made the final decision that she was going to announce. The maid, of course, was a little worried, but she asked what kind of decision this was. And at that moment, Elena turned to her and, smiling, said that they should immediately ask for an audience with His Majesty, because she was already ready to come to him. The girl understood perfectly well that if everything went smoothly, she would become the greatest treasure chest of all. She will be a magnificent Marchioness, so wonderful that killing her will be simply unthinkable. At this very time, on the hills near the domain of Marquis Burkett, several warriors gathered and everyone was very alarmed. Their leader came closer to the men and immediately asked what had happened, and someone explained that the armed forces had captured the castle gates. Viscount Walt, upon hearing this, was immediately worried and asked them not to tell him that it was Lipa, but his assistant replied that they had entered their territory without even declaring war, and he considered this act to be very cowardly and senseless. The man, who had already come up with a plan of action at that moment, asked them all to remain calm, and he also told them to stop their movement and wait for further instructions. The men said that they would do so, and the boy himself thought about what was behind them, and if they did not overtake their knights, they would not be able to storm the castle. But the moment he took out his telescope to peer into the distance, he saw bright golden hair fluttering in the wind. Then the man focused and saw a beautiful girl standing accompanied by knights. After that, he addressed all the groups and said that he was returning to the castle right away. He also added that he would leave the cleaning up after the expedition to Roy. As soon as his assistant heard this, he was immediately very surprised and asked the commander why he made such an unexpected decision. But Viscount Walt then said with just one word that the attacker was his fiancée, and that was why he had to make such a decision. The girl, who had been standing near the gate all this time, suddenly saw a horse approaching them. Of course, at that time their governments were in a state of truce and ceasefire with the Lipa companies. So Elena assumed that it probably happened right after their training ended. The man, accompanied by his knights, stopped right in front of the girl, and for a while he was simply silent. After that he got off his horse, but he could not take his eyes off her. In fact, 2 whole years had passed since she had last seen him, and Elena was well aware that during all this time he had probably become even more inaccessible and distant. The girl also looked at him without taking her eyes off him. However, when this continued for some time, she felt very uncomfortable and a little scared. Of course, she was frightened just by meeting Lord Walt, and so, to stop her hands from shaking, she touched her dress. In fact, she had been afraid of him ever since that day when that simply terrible sight had happened, namely 12 years ago. Several years ago, when their engagement was agreed upon, Elena first met Walt. She was only 8 years old and was in the garden looking at flowers. The man was much older than her. He was already years old at that time, and he was standing next to his partner and talking very energetically about something. When Elena noticed him, she of course immediately recognized him. He was the eldest son of Marquis Burkett. She assumed that he got along very well with his employee, and because of this she even envied him a little, because with her, everything was not like that at all. The girl never had friends, and because of this she became very sad. But Elena quickly tried to push away all these sad thoughts, because she understood that they only confused her. The girl knew that she only had a sister with whom she could communicate well, so having collected a bouquet of white flowers, she decided to hurry to bring it to her. Some time passed from that moment, and on the way to her sister, Elena even wove a whole beautiful and delightful wreath from these collected flowers. She thought he looked incredibly cute and was pleased with her work. She also wondered if her sister would be happy when she saw him. And at that moment, as she was about to go further, she suddenly stopped because right in front of her, a man fell to the ground who had been screaming very loudly all this time. Elena was very surprised, but at that moment she looked into the eyes of this man who asked for help, and fear and despair were visible in his eyes. But the girl didn't even have time to blink because Walt appeared behind her. He simply mercilessly killed this man with his sword in front of her eyes. There was a lot of blood flowing around, and the man fell lifeless at the feet of the girl, who was incredibly shocked by what she saw. Elena just stood and looked at the dead man who, just a couple of minutes ago, had asked her for help. The girl was incredibly confused and did not understand that this had just happened. But what surprised her most was the fact that it was Walt's assistant. Just a few minutes ago, they were both talking peacefully and even laughing, but now he lay dead at the hand of his master. Walt pulled her out of her thoughts and offered his deepest apologies to the second princess for having to witness all of this. He immediately began to approach his former assistant and said that he would immediately clean everything up, and also continued to ask her for forgiveness. Elena was so shocked that she couldn't even stand up. She burst into tears and sat on the ground, her whole body shaking. The maid tried her calm down, but it's useless. No matter how scared the girl was, she couldn't take her eyes off the man who had just taken and mercilessly killed his partner. But she couldn't understand, even after all these years, why he did it. But what surprised her most was that in such a situation, after killing his partner, he remained incredibly calm and balanced. Elena was already horrified even from a simple glance at the corpse, but he, having killed a loved one for himself, remained completely calm. She literally felt like she was starting to choke. The girl was having a real panic attack, and the wreath she had woven for her sister simply fell out of her hands. The girl even lost consciousness at that moment because the shock had taken over her body so much that she could no longer fight. Of course, a little later she was told that it had been discovered that the employee was a spy for the enemy kingdom of Lipa, and Lord Walt simply had to kill the man on the spot. However, even after Elena learned the whole truth, the shock of this incident was too strong and traumatic. At the same time, the girl came to the conclusion that Lord Walt was the kind of person who, without any hesitation, could kill in cold blood even someone close to him. And it was this factor that turned out to be an incredibly big source of fear for Elena throughout all these years. Her father was the king, and should have known this too. However, after a few years, he summoned his daughter and told her that she was engaged to Walt, the new Marquis of Burkett. He also told his daughter that she would marry him the year she came of age, and he did not want to hear anything more. Elena was so shocked that she turned to her father in a trembling voice and asked him to choose someone else, anyone at all except Lord Walt. But the man was adamant. He said the contract was already made, and so she had to do her duty as a member of the royal family, without any exceptions. The girl was then in such despair that she was even ready to throw herself at her father's feet, but the maid stopped her, so she simply screamed and begged him to do something differently, to choose another groom for her. She was even ready to marry some old man, just not Lord Walt. But the man did not listen to her. He simply turned around and left the room. And even though Elena was tormented by nightmares throughout this entire time, and every time she saw this man she felt dizzy, all this was completely unimportant. It was at that moment, after her father's statement, that she realized for the first time in her life that she was nothing more than a treasure chest for the royal family, and for her own people. She was just a thing that could be exchanged as profitably as possible. Of course, since all the aristocrats learned this news, they began to spread rumors about this situation. And Lord Walt's reputation was not too good. All people said that he left a road of corpses in his midst and did not spare anyone. So now, when Elena, already at the age of 20, stood right in front of him, she tried to calm herself down, because she knew what she was getting into from the very beginning. Elena noticed that as he grew up, he became even more terrifying. She also knew what the enemies called this man, and it was a pretty scary nickname. With his black hair and incredibly dark-colored armor, the moment they encountered him on the battlefield, this man simply devoured their life. And that was why this man was nicknamed the Grim Reaper of the Black Angel. And because of this nickname, everyone began to believe that his invincible legend would continue further. However, in Elena's past life, Lord Walt died in one of these battles. And Elena understood that most likely, if he died in this life, then she was simply destined to die with him. At that moment, Walt came closer to her, and the girl at that moment thought that she did not want to die. And that meant that she would save his life in every possible way, even if she had to do something that she categorically did not want. The knights who remained behind at this moment looked at each other in surprise, because they didn't even know what to do now. However, one of them, who was Roy himself and was Walter's right hand, winked at him and told everyone to stay put and be very quiet, because their master had a very important matter to decide. He also told the others, who were talking at that moment, that a true knight must always remain calm and composed, and that was why he relied on them. But the guy also understood that even if he said such things, it still made everyone nervous, even him. Although he didn't show that he was very worried, in fact, he didn't understand why the princess had come in person and what she was trying to achieve. so he was incredibly afraid of his master's reaction. He heard many people say that she refused to leave the royal capital, using excuses to stay there as long as possible. And she spent her days buying luxurious items like jewelry and works of art from famous artists, all just for fun. Therefore, such rumors even reached the border where people lived a poor life. They really hated this girl because they had nothing to eat, and she bought completely unnecessary things and did not even use them. And that's why this princess was incredibly mysterious, but at the same time a very hypocritical person. So Roy was very interested to know what she was going to achieve by coming right to the gates. This girl showed up without prior notice and was brought in very quickly, and she was accompanied by many knights from the royal capital. So Roy didn't know if this case could be considered and assessed as a threat, so he decided to stay away until his boss gave some sign. He also knew the fact that Elena continued to postpone the wedding, so he was completely confused and did not understand why she suddenly came to the master so abruptly. The man, meanwhile, greeted Princess Elena and bowing greeted her. When he looked up again, he met her gaze and said that it had been quite a while since they last saw each other, but he was still glad to see her. Elena was simply silent at this point. She looked for a while at the man, who bowed again as a sign of respect and was now waiting for her to return the gesture in his direction. At that moment, the girl extended her hand forward and agreed with him, saying that they really hadn't seen each other for a long time. As soon as Walt saw her gesture, he was a little surprised. However, he understood that he simply had to follow etiquette. The man took off his glove and took her hand with his own, and then kissed it tenderly as a sign of greeting. Elena, meanwhile, just stood and watched as he touched her fingers with his cold but gentle lips. However, she also felt his hand touch her palm, and noticed that this man had quite warm hands, much to her surprise. And at that moment, the girl realized that it didn't matter how scary he seemed. This man was not the Grim Reaper at all, as many people called him. Yes, of course he can be a little scary, and the fact that he kills people with a cold expression on his face does not make him a monster. He is the same person with blood running through his veins. For a while, Elena just looked at him. However, at that moment, the man turned to her and asked what brought her to him on this beautiful winter day. He also said that, judging by all the guards who accompanied her, he could conclude that this was an unusual incident, and she did not just come to say hello. Elena was a little embarrassed at this point. However, turning around, she said that from his point of view, she was surprised to realize that, in his opinion, this was something serious. However, the man continued to insist on his own and said that he really thought so. And the girl at that moment approached one of her companions and, taking a piece of paper from him, said that in that case, it was very good that he understood everything correctly. The man was a little surprised, and he decided to just wait until she explained everything, because he didn't understand what the girl was getting at. He already had a lot to do, and she was distracting him. But Elena, without saying a single word, came back closer to him and held out her hand, in which she held a scroll of paper. When she saw his surprised expression, she asked him to accept it all. Before the man had time to read everything, she smiled and said that she still agreed to become his wife, and that was why she wanted him to carefully look over these papers. In fact, in her past life, when she was taken prisoner, the girl was told incredibly sad news for her rather quickly. When Elena was tied up, she continued to yell at them and call everyone idiots, and also asked if they even understood what they were doing and with whom. She was about to say who she was. However, a man with dark hair approached her and said that she was the one who killed her older brother, namely her fiancé. As soon as Elena heard this, she was genuinely surprised, but she immediately recognized the man who approached her. After all, it was Baron Burkett's second son, Jan. Elena was simply devastated at the time because she didn't expect him to say that Walter was killed. Of course, she could have imagined any scenario, but certainly not the death of her previous fiancé. Ian stood in front of her and said that she knew very well how strong the knights from their family were, and he was truly surprised that she was able to endure all this while in such a difficult situation, since these knights were ordered to kill her. They all believed that the long-awaited treasure was the princess, and she would finally be delivered to them. However, the girl did everything completely differently, and thus set up their entire family. Jan then began to shout at her loudly, and said that in the end their treasure was never found. The other nobles also saw no need for urgent help, and so postponed their support in order to agree with the royal family. Elena at this point started screaming something in her defense. She said that it was all because they also believed in Lord Walt's power. But Jan was simply furious, and he wondered why, in that case, his older brother died in the middle of the battlefield without any support or sympathy. Of course, Elena understood that there was a drop of her guilt in this. She did not know what to do, and so for some time she just sat in silence. She looked the man straight in the eye and asked, was it really because of this incident that he decided to betray the royal family as well? But Ian had a different opinion on this matter. He said in a cold voice, looking the girl in the eyes, that she was actually the first one to betray them, so this was just a response to her betrayal. Looking into her eyes, he said that his elder brother and the Knights of Burkett had sacrificed absolutely everything, even their lives. However, she not brought them necessary treasure. So he decided not to let any of their men and knights become victims anymore by not fulfilling his promise. She was becoming a useless princess, so he decided it was time to get rid of this burden. The knight grabbed the girl by the shoulder and began to lead her away, and the man finally said that if she had to hold a grudge, then in that case she should blame her own stupidity and only her. Thus, starting with the girl, the royal family was betrayed, and eventually they were all punished accordingly. And this was precisely the reason why, in his new life, Elena brought him the treasure that she was supposed to. There really was a whole cart with various goods behind the girl, as well as many knights. She really hoped that now everything would be different, and the man would be happy with such a contribution. Of course, when she looked at Walter and all his minions, she saw incredibly big surprise in their eyes. But this was exactly what she expected. This was the effect the girl wanted. For a while, Elena just stood there, holding out the scroll to him. However, after that, she took his hand and handed it over anyway. The man finally came to his senses and said that he would confirm the letter a little later. Then the gates opened, and he said that now they had better head inside the castle. Because it was cold outside, they still had so much to discuss. Elena, of course, was a little surprised. The man, meanwhile, simply turned around and began to walk towards the castle, meanwhile unrolling the scroll and studying it. At that moment, the girl remained standing in place. She realized that everything was happening completely differently than she had planned, so it threw her off balance a little. But she still said that she understood everything, so she followed the man and took one escort with her just in case. As soon as they entered, Elena saw that there were many maids and various servants standing on the sides. Before heading to the office, the man approached one of them and began to discuss something with her. The girl also stopped. She had some time to look around the estate, and she noticed that it was in good condition, but not as fancy and rich as it could have been. Walter addressed her, attracting her attention. When the girl heard this, she turned around. The man, meanwhile, pointed towards the maid and said that if she needed anything, Chloe would be with her at all times until an official maid was appointed. The maid smiled awkwardly and said that her name was Chloe and that she was from the Baron Cole family, and also added that she was very glad to meet the girl. At that moment, Elena came closer to her and said that she understood everything, and also told the girl in response that she was also pleased to meet her. After this, Walter bowed to the princess and said that he had some knight's business to take care of, so he needed to leave for a while. Time she would inspect estate. Chloe approached her and asked the princess to allow her to show her the room she would now be in. Elena did not object, and together with the maid and her assistant, they went to the other side of the estate, and Walter remained in the hallway. For a while he looked in the direction the girl had gone and said nothing. And then of this anyway went by his own affairs. As Elena walked behind the maid, she was glad that at least she had been assigned a noblewoman as her maid, because that should really correspond to her status. Even if she has the status of a princess, the bride must leave her maids and rely entirely on her husband's household in all matters. Thus the girl left her entire old life behind, and now desired a new one, the one that her husband had arranged for her. Of course, the girl was not accompanied by anyone, but she was not sure whether they knew or understood the correct etiquette at all. She did not have time to ask her maid anything, because they suddenly stopped, and Chloe, bowing, said that she would use this room for a while until they could find something better. As soon as Elena saw this room, she was incredibly surprised. She looked around for a while, and then suddenly frowned. She turned to the maid and asked if she understood correctly that this was a guest room. Chloe then explained in a calm voice that the room had been given to the princess on the instructions of the master of the house. She had simply carried out his request and had no idea what exactly was needed. Before leaving, she also told the girl that if she suddenly needed anything, she could simply ring the bell, and then they would come to her and fulfill her request. As soon as Elena heard this, she was very angry. She did not understand why she was not taken to the women's room, because if they were so eagerly awaiting her arrival, they should have been prepared for her to appear at any moment. The girl really believed that since he wanted to take her as his wife and was simply waiting for her answer, this room should have been prepared long ago and would have been waiting for its mistress. But all it worked out, not because she, I thought. Elena sighed heavily, walked over to the sofa that stood in the middle of the room, and sat down on it, thinking that this had happened suddenly. So she understood why she had been placed in this room and forced to wait some time until the next one. However, the girl was still not happy with this. Some time passed from that moment, and the next evening no one came to tell her that she could move into her lady's room. Of course, the girl was irritated by all this. She couldn't believe that even after the whole night, the room still wouldn't be ready. And besides, she was served dinner in the guest room and was not invited to dine with the Marquis, so this also surprised her quite a bit. In fact, sometime earlier, when Chloe came to Elena, the girl asked how long they would treat her as if she had just come to visit. The maid was a little surprised by such words, but smiling, she said that until they received permission from the owner of the house, they would do everything as prescribed in protocol. She also asked the princess to remain patient until that moment and just wait, since there was nothing she could do anyway. Of course, Helen was angry. She had actually brought a lot of treasure, so she felt she had the right to wield the power of a wife, but she was treated as if she were an unimportant guest, and most people simply ignored her. Therefore, the girl decided that she would go on reconnaissance herself and find out everything she needed. So what after dinner she went walk by castle. Accompanied by her assistant, she suddenly saw a guy walking past them dressed in a knight's uniform, and Elena turned to him and asked where Lord Walt was. The man was immediately surprised and even a little scared when he saw her. However, coming closer to her, he said in a trembling voice that the guy had just passed this way some time ago. Elena, practically ignoring his words, went forward and said that she understood everything, and also, not forgetting her manners, thanked the guy for the information. After that, she approached some of the maids who were cleaning the castle and the rest of the knights, all the while asking if they had seen Lord Walter. Some time passed from that moment, and the girl suddenly, passing by one of the rooms, heard a rather familiar voice. This surprised her very much. She immediately turned to the side, and her assistant Matthew immediately asked if everything was okay with her. But the girl, quickly passing by him, asked him to stay in that place and wait for her. She herself wanted to go and check that is happening. Then Elena saw open doors not far from her and immediately went towards them. The girl stopped in front of the doors for a while and realized that the coat of arms of the Burkett family was engraved on them. The girl dared to assume that this was Lord Walt's private room. However, it could also be a woman's resting place. She could not know for sure. When the girl looked through the crack, she heard someone's voice again. He was addressing Walter directly and asking if he really was going to change the furnishings in the ladies' room. His butler, who was responsible for such decisions, was alarmed. He said that everything had been prepared so carefully, and he felt that the renovation was a complete waste of time and money. However, the man was absolutely confident in his decision and said that in all this situation, in his opinion, it would be quite difficult for Princess Elena to live in this place. Therefore, and he accepted solution change. A little interior. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She did not immediately understand what this could mean, so she decided to open the door even more to see what was there. And the moment she did, she saw an incredibly cute pink room. There were stuffed animals on the bed, and everything looked quite small and miniature. As soon as she saw all this, she was simply horrified and did not understand why there was such a childish atmosphere around the chambers. After all, it really looked more like a playroom for a child. Elena also couldn't understand who would even like something like this. However, after thinking for a bit, the girl suddenly came to the decision that Walter, probably thinking that his wife would not come, got himself a mistress and decorated the entire room exactly in her style. Of course, it was hard for the girl to realize that this man had a mistress. However, she could not make hasty conclusions. After some thought, Elena made a rather impulsive but correct, in her opinion, decision. She opened the doors and thought that she was, in fact, the person who would become the mistress of this castle. And she wasn't going to let any man take away even a crumb of her newfound power. When the door opened and the men saw Elena, they were very surprised, but she did not even greet them. Turning to her fiancé, she said that if he gave priority to his beloved, she would certainly never forgive him. As soon as Walter heard this suggestion, he was so surprised that he couldn't even respond. He didn't expect that he could be accused of having a mistress. Elena, meanwhile, began to approach him with slow steps and thought that he assumed that he had hidden her well. However, she was going to find her and put the girl in her place so that she would know who was the boss in that house. When she was quite close to the man, she said that if he preferred his mistress more, then she would take revenge on him for it. The man, as soon as he heard all this, sighed heavily and thought that all this was happening again. This already start even annoy for such time. In fact, at that moment, Princess Elena did not even take her eyes off him. However, he not understood by which reason this happened. Up until this point, the girl had avoided him in every possible way. However, now everything has changed, and she even sets her own conditions. In fact, 10 years ago, in the reception room of the royal palace, they finally met, because Elena's father strictly insisted on this marriage, and they had to get to know each other a little better. When Walter stood in front of the girl completely calmly, he only watched how scared she was. Elena's whole body was shaking with fear, and even her voice was trembling. She turned to him and introduced herself, saying that from that moment on she was his fiancée, but she was unable to finish the last sentence because she was incredibly worried. The girl was so shocked that she couldn't even stand on her feet. She fell to the ground. Her housekeeper immediately started running to her, and Walter himself couldn't stay away. They asked if she was okay. The man then extended his hand forward to help her stand up and asked if she was feeling okay. As soon as Elena looked into his eyes, she immediately remembered that scene from her childhood, when he killed his assistant and friend before her very eyes. She had no intention of accepting his hand, so she simply sat there, huddled. At that moment, the man himself remembered how she had lost consciousness in tears because of the fear she had experienced. So Walter stopped even trying. He dropped his hand and just watched as Elena's housekeeper tried to calm her down and get her to stand up and continue the conversation. When she failed to do so, she approached Walter directly and apologized. She explained that the girl was not feeling well, so their meeting would have to be rescheduled. However, the man was quite understanding and said that she shouldn't worry about it. He all understands. Health was above total. After that, the maid helped Elena get up and began to take the girl to her room. There, in turn, she held her head because it was spinning and hurting. Feelings were with her not from pleasant, and Walter, who stood there for a while, thought about it and realized that over time she had stopped losing consciousness at the sight of him, but still continued to avoid him. And now that they were both grown up, she was even able to allow a little physical contact. Namely, when they met, he kissed her hand. Moreover, she herself even took the initiative for him to do so. Of course, all this was very surprising for Walter, but after thinking the whole situation over carefully, he turned to the butler and spoke to him. The guy asked the man to listen to all the wishes of Princess Elena and fulfill them to the best of his ability. His butler, of course, was a little surprised, but bowed and said that he understood everything, and also added that he would do everything as it should be. After this, the man decided to simply leave so that Elena would be more comfortable discussing all her wishes regarding the interior with the butler. However, when he walked out the door, he immediately stopped and still did not understand why she suddenly started talking about some mistress, because he had not even given any signs about this. Some time had passed since then. The girl was in her room. Next to her were some textbooks that she wanted to study, and the butler came to her. For several days, they discussed the girl's wishes in full, and he said that they would need some more time to prepare for her move. The man also said that they would definitely replace the previous furniture with new furniture, which is what she asked for. Elena, smiling, thanked him and said that it was even great. She didn't mind waiting a little. The main thing was that all her criteria were taken into account. Of course, Elena was pleased to realize that she was being cared for so much and that any of her requests would be fulfilled. She was also pleased with the fact that she was able to replace all the furniture and bedding with those that she liked. When the butler left, the girl stood up from her seat and thought that the worst thing would be if her mistress used the gift items. But this is not the case, and even the man himself allowed everything to be replaced. Meanwhile, she went to the window and saw how many maids were just emptying that room and carrying various things out into the street, so that they could then be picked up and taken somewhere else. She also thought that her moving into this room would also be a great time for him to break up with his mistress, since now people would know that they were officially together. One fine sunny day, the maids went outside to hang out the laundry. One of them turned to another and asked if she had seen the mountain of provisions that the princess had brought with her. The maid said with admiration that she had seen all of this, and also added that it was simply amazing, because now they could be completely calm, which made their life much easier. At that time, the knights, who had been training since the morning, discussed all of this, because rumors had spread throughout the entire estate quite quickly. The knights were very glad that the princess had also brought with her a large number of knights from the royal capital, as this would make their lives and the battles that lay ahead easier. His partner, who was drying under a towel, said that now, even if another war with the linden tree starts, everything will be fine. They will be able to withstand this pressure and even win. The maids who were working inside at that time, wiping the glass and changing the curtains, were also very happy about the princess's arrival, because they believed that she brought a truly new, fresh life to their estate. They were indeed very talkative, and they simply idolized the princess because she gave them new hope in life. But Chloe, who had been listening to all of this, did not share their opinion. She turned to them in a rough voice and asked, "Can't they see how carefree they are about all of this?" The maids, hearing this, were very surprised and asked what she meant. And the maid explained that they needed to remember the princess's latest actions, namely all her whims and reckless purchases. Elena really went off the rails for a while. She bought various decorations at her fiancé's expense, was always picky and yelled at the maids, and never greeted him. Once the maids remembered all this, they were a little surprised, but they realized that Chloe was indeed telling the truth. The girl sighed heavily and said that even in the ladies' room she gave so many strict orders that in the end she simply increased their workload several times, and they had absolutely no time to do anything. Chloe continued to rant, even as her companions laughed. She said that Her Highness's wedding might now look very grand, but it would not last as long as one might think. In fact, Chloe believed that until the princess arrived, she was the highest-ranking woman in the king's employ, as she was the daughter of a baron, and everyone listened to her, and even some were afraid of her. The servants always carefully watched and treated her with respect and blessing in some moments, in order to avoid her inconvenience, because she could do something bad to them, since she had a higher status. But now Chloe was very unhappy, because her whole usual life had become completely different with the arrival of a higher status girl, namely Princess Elena. Because of the incompetent princess, according to the girl who happened to be born into a noble family, Chloe has now lost all of her position that she had been building for even several years. After a long silence, she turned to the maids and asked, "Can Princess Elena even fulfill the role of mistress of the castle?" I doubted it. One of the maids was very worried and asked what she was saying, because she didn't know if it was even possible to say such things about her mistress. But the maid simply asked them to think about the princess spending her time completely ignorant of the rules and customs of this territory. She changes every little detail, no matter how many years these habits have been in life. The maids immediately began to doubt who they were even trusting. One of them even said that even if it was all true, they had no choice but to follow her. But Chloe, smiling evilly, said that they shouldn't worry so much because she already had a decision on this matter. She looked at her partners and said in a sweet voice that she simply needed to become the master's mistress and take over absolutely all power. In fact, in the noble society of the Viftachi kingdom, women are considered the property of their husbands and immediately after marriage. And it doesn't matter at all how noble the origin of the wife is or how low the status of the husband is, perhaps the absolute power over the wife belongs to the man, and this is unfortunate. However, for Chloe, this was a great way out, because even if the royal family refrains from interfering in the affairs of a married princess, she will be able to calmly influence everything that happens in the house. Seeing the maids hesitant, Chloe said that it was simply not officially recognized, but she had heard of cases where any lover was trusted to run the entire household. The maid then turned to her in a trembling voice and asked if she thought the situation had gone too far and that it was somehow wrong. But Chloe, turning away from them, sighed heavily and said that compared to the princess and what they knew from rumors, she was the daughter of a loyal nobleman who had served for many years faithfully and truly. In a quieter voice, she said that her consistency and authority were far ahead, and of course she believed that the master would see that it was much more useful for Chloe to be supportive than for the princess. The girl also said that she did not think at all that she was losing to Elena in terms of appearance, so she believed that she had every chance of winning. She told her friends that if the owner wished, she could even offer him comfortable services. But at that moment, Elena's voice was heard. She came up to them and said that it was disgusting for her to hear all this. The maids, of course, were immediately frightened. They looked to the side and really saw their mistress, and then they realized that now they were in no mood for jokes. The maids immediately began to scream, but covered their mouths with their hands so as not to disturb anyone. They immediately began to apologize to Elena for their behavior. Chloe just stood there and looked at the lady with her mouth open in surprise. She couldn't believe that this was really happening. But Elena, meanwhile, turned to her assistant and asked him to grab Chloe. At that moment, the man immediately ran up to the maid and, grabbing her hands behind her back, said that everything had been done as she had asked. The other maids stood aside and silently watched everything that was happening. They understood that if they said even one more word, a similar situation could happen to them, and this frightened them even more. At that moment, Elena approached one of them and, taking the scissors from her pocket, said that she would take this for a while. As soon as Chloe saw this, she even started sweating from fear. She understood what the girl was going to do, but she couldn't fully believe it, so she just asked what she was planning. Elena came closer to her and, taking a few strands of hair in her hand, said that she would make her understand where she was at all. Of course, the maid was even more scared. She had already started imagining various terrible scenarios that could happen. But at that moment, the princess began to do her job. And so after some time, Elena cut off a few strands of hair from the maid. Chloe looked at her precious hair, which she loved more than anything in the world, on the floor, and was ready to cry on the spot from this. Then the princess moved away from her and asked her why she was suddenly so surprised, and asked if she even understood that this was only the beginning of her proof. And so some time passed from that moment. Elena was sitting in her room and looking at the jewelry she had recently purchased. The girl was positively beaming with joy when she looked at them. In fact, when she bought and then put on various jewelry, she felt calm and peaceful. When she was thinking about something, a maid suddenly came up to her and, taking the chest with jewelry, said that she would bring it to the jewelry box. Elena, of course, was very surprised by such speed. She didn't even have time to blink an eye, as suddenly the maid had already moved to the closet, which was located nearby. She took these beautiful earrings out of the box and immediately began to put them into Elena's jewelry box. After that, as if nothing had happened, she simply took and was about to throw away the box, but the princess managed to stop her in time. She screamed loudly at the maid and asked her what she was doing with this beautiful and very precious box. The maid looked at her in surprise and asked, "Isn't it obvious?" Then she explained to the girl that they were giving her up, and therefore they needed to get rid of this unnecessary thing. Helen, hearing this, looked at the maid in surprise, and she, laughing, replied that the earrings were kept in a safe place, which meant that her empty box no longer needed to be kept. It was of no use at all, so it needed to be gotten rid of. She immediately threw the box into the trash bin and explained that no one would need it anymore. Elena was simply horrified by what she saw. However, at that moment, she suddenly heard someone's familiar voice behind her, which was addressing her. It was a young girl. She said that they were like treasure chests. What the owner wanted was the treasure inside, not in them. Helen, hearing this, was very surprised. When she looked to the side, she recognized this person. It was her sister Clarissa. She, in turn, continued to smile happily and said that if she lost the title of princess, then this would become her reality. The sister explained to the girl in no way that she should lose her status. Otherwise, she would simply be thrown into the trash, just like this jewelry box. Elena immediately opened her eyes. Her breathing was labored. However, after some time, which she needed to think, she realized that it was just a dream. The girl touched her head, which was now simply splitting, and realized that she had fallen asleep before she had time to realize it. But in fact, what surprised her most, and even frightened her to some extent, was the fact that she had a dream about her sister. She sighed heavily, thinking that this girl had been married into a ducal family and was now living a luxurious life, not thinking at all about her family. However, she recalled the words of the butler, who said that the Baron had instructed them to fulfill as many of Her Highness's requests as possible, and she did not know whether she could really take full advantage of this position. Elena was also very worried whether everything was okay with him, because some time had passed since they last saw each other, and there had been no news from him during this time. For a while, she just sat on the bed and thought about different things. Then she turned to Matthew, and going out into the hallway told him to follow her. She thought that she should feel much more reassured when she saw her renovated women's bedroom. So she decided to go in there and see how things were going there, and what process they were in. After some time, Elena finally came, and when she saw the result, she was even pleased. She really thought that it would be almost finished by the time she came. However, she did not think that the work could be done so well and so quickly. Elena noticed that there were only a few small details left to be finished in the room, and she could finally move in. The girl was very happy that the main repair work was done. As soon as she entered the room, she immediately heard Chloe's voice, and these events took place until the moment Elena decided to punish the girl. Of course, once she heard the phrases that Chloe was saying, She couldn't just stay put. Elena smiled and thought that everything was exactly as she thought. Her sweet Chloe turned out to be completely different from what she wanted to be. She was just pretending to be a very friendly girl, but in reality, she was not like that at all. The girl continued to stand behind the wall for a while. She thought that servants who pretended to be loyal were the same everywhere. Therefore, it was not difficult for her to easily expose this girl, who thought she was smarter than everyone else. However, the moment she heard that Chloe was going to become her fiancé's mistress, Elena was truly surprised because she certainly could not expect such a thing from an ordinary maid. For a while, the girl just stood there and listened to all this. And then she realized that there really are some dukes who show favoritism towards their mistresses rather than their officially appointed wives. That's exactly what happened to her sister, and so she knew very well how terrible it could be for everyone. Elena had also heard that if she had married Walt, she would not have been able to interfere in his affairs, even father. However, the moment Chloe said that she could satisfy any desire of the master, Elena could no longer stand to listen to all this. Of course, she hated it when someone tried to take away something that was rightfully hers, so Elena acted quite emotionally, but also rationally. When Elena continued to cut Chloe's hair, the girl said that she was trying to take something important away from her, and that's why she simply had to get her punishment. The princess also said that she could not recognize her as a lady. At this moment, many maids and knights gathered near this door and listened and also watched what was happening. Elena continued to cut her hair and said that her daughter, simply in defense, dared to act above her, a princess in status, and this was simply impudence on her part, and even more so to conspire and persuade the maids to her side. She also replied that Chloe might think that her valuable appearance could captivate Lord Walt, but that was certainly not going to happen now, and Elena had no intention of that happening. At this point, she finally finished her massacre, and when it was all over, Chloe had very short hair, and she didn't look as attractive as she did before. As soon as the girl looked in the mirror, she was incredibly angry. She could not believe that Elena really did this to her beautiful long hair. And what's more, she took it and humiliated her in front of all the other maids. Now her authority was even more undermined, and Chloe didn't know what to do with such short hair, like a man's. Elena looked at her angrily for a while, after which she said that apparently the girl still did not understand her place, so she would continue her punishment. But at that moment, Lord Yan's voice was heard from behind, shouting and asking her to finally stop and stop doing this. Elena, hearing his voice, immediately recognized him. He pushed the girl away from Chloe and, continuing to shout, said that he would not tolerate such cruel treatment of living people. So he said that she had no right to do this to the staff of his castle, and that is why he demands that she immediately stop doing all this. After that, looking the girl straight in the eyes, he said that if she held a grudge, then she should blame her own stupidity, since she could believe the words of this stupid maid. Elena's hands even started shaking from what she heard. She was now being humiliated in front of all the servants, and especially in front of Chloe. At that moment, when she thought about it, she realized that it would be much safer for her to leave a good impression on Lord Yan in this life, so she had to urgently somehow get out of this situation. But when the man continued to yell at her, Elena suddenly thought that she actually also had pride that she wanted to keep. So she moved away from him and also started yelling. The girl said that if he had any complaints, then before he acted in any way, he should think carefully about whether he really wanted this to happen. She looked at him with disdain and said that she was not stupid enough to punish someone without a reason, so she wanted him to step aside and calm down already. Then the girl reached for Chloe with the scissors again. Ian didn't understand what was happening and was even scared. He asked her in a trembling voice to wait a while and they would clear everything up. But the girl said she wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to stop until that horrible Chloe accepted her sins. And if that didn't happen, then Lord Walt would do something about it too. At that moment, the door to the room opened and Mr. Wald himself appeared there. He had his shirt unbuttoned because he had just returned from training. The man looked at his brother and sister-in-law and immediately asked what they were saying about him. As soon as Elena saw him, she couldn't believe that he had come too, because he usually ignored such quarrels. At that moment, the man took a closer look at Elena and saw scissors in her hands. He immediately realized that he had to do something about it, otherwise the situation would go too far. He walked up to her very quickly and, taking the scissors from her hands, said that from what he had seen, blades could be very dangerous when used by people under strong emotional influence. As soon as Elena heard this, she was very surprised. She couldn't even resist and just looked the man straight in the eyes. He was holding her hand at that moment, and Elena didn't even let it go. Then he slowly started doing it, and said that, fortunately, it seemed to him that neither she nor anyone else was injured, and that made things easier for him. She continued to look at him, and immediately thought that he thought it was someone else's fault. The man, meanwhile, slowly took her hands and began to lead her away from Chloe, and Elena just stood there and did not understand what was going on and why he was acting so calmly, because she thought that he would start scolding her for what happened. Chloe, who was sitting on the floor at that moment and watching all this, finally breathed a sigh of relief and even smiled. She realized that she was finally safe. She was very happy that her loyalty, which had been built over all these years of service, had become much stronger than this worthless status of a princess. She was also looking forward to how the master would begin to protect her from this woman and defend her pride, and perhaps also somehow compensate for the moral damage. At that moment, Elena glanced at the girl, who was positively beaming with joy and was upset that she looked delighted. Elena also thought about how Lord Walt had taken the scissors from her just to protect that horrible traitor in Chloe, and she just couldn't believe it. She stood there for a while as Walt continued to lead her out of the room, but the girl, angry with him, removed her hands and, screaming, said that she actually told him that if he preferred his mistress first, then she would never forgive him for it.